Okay, so in this section, we're going to be talking about memory, Chapter 8. Full disclosure, I specialize in memory as a researcher, so this is my, oh my gosh, favorite topic. I'll try and explain things in a little bit more accessible language than Myers does. Myers is a social psychologist, and so sometimes he can be a little vague in describing cognitive things. So hopefully I'll do a slightly better job, a little bit more detail. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay. We're going to use this model as our basic model for memory. It was invented in 1968 by Atkinson-Shiffrin, a team of researchers, and they, notice the year, 1968. They were heavily influenced by the advent of the computer. And not computers like we all know, but computers like apparently in the olden days of the 1960s, they had ginormous, entire room-filling computers that could store information and retrieve information. And so Atkinson and Shiffrin, in their effort to explain how us humans store information and retrieve information, thought maybe our brains work like computers. So they used the computer as a model. So we'll go through this whole model as the chapter goes on. But the basic idea is that you've got, sorry I pushed a button by accident, you've got external events that are occurring out in the environment, sights, sounds, some of which you're paying attention to and some of which you are not. All of that information is landing in your sensory memory. The first box here is the sensory memory where information lands first. Those sensory memories are going to be literally held in your sense organs. That gives you a slight fraction of a second, in most cases, opportunity to pay attention to that part of the environment that's important or novel. We call this encoding. When you pay attention, it causes you to transfer the information from sensory memory into your working or short-term memory store. We call that process encoding. Now, when Atkinson and Shiffrin developed this model, they called this next box short-term memory. Recent researchers have started to use the word working as a synonym for short-term, which is not really accurate. Just going to say, I'll explain that a little bit later, why that's not exactly right. But the idea is there's this box where information is held briefly for some amount of time. And as long as you continue to engage in maintenance rehearsal, where you continue to think about the material over and over again, it'll stay in that short-term memory indefinitely. Now, the distinction between short-term memory, which would be a box where information is held for some amount of time, researchers don't exactly agree on how long information is held, somewhere between 30 seconds and maybe 2 days. So kind of a wide variation in how long we think you might hold stuff in your short-term memory. The difference between this box called short-term memory and this thing called working memory is really what I've got highlighted at the bottom here, executive functioning. Working memory involves executive functions, which is where you choose what you're going to pay attention to. You choose what you're going to respond to. That's the job, the executive function that working memory provides. Now, you can engage in auditory rehearsal to keep information active in your working memory. Auditory rehearsal is where you literally repeat a word. Let's say maybe you're trying to memorize the password for your new student account, and so you literally repeat it over and over and over again, either in your head auditorily where you're thinking the numbers or the letters, or where you literally say it out loud. When I was a kid, we had to use this kind of auditory rehearsal a lot more frequently than we do these days, because when I was a kid, our phones didn't capture each other's phone numbers. So if I was told a friend's phone number and didn't have anything to write it down on, I would engage in auditory rehearsal to keep that number in my memory long enough to find something to write it down on. And then, of course, the beauty of working or short-term memory is that once you have finished processing the information, it can literally leave your mind and it'll be like you never saw it. That's the beauty of the short-term memory store, is that if you write it down on a piece of paper and your brain's like, okay, good, that's where I'll keep that one, I don't have to keep it any further in my head, your head will be like, I can't even remember the first digit. We definitely have got to find that piece of paper. So auditory rehearsal is where you're literally saying it out loud or saying it out loud in your head. The visuospatial sketchpad is another aspect of working memory that talks about how you visualize your surroundings. So an example of using your visuospatial sketchpad would be imagining what the room would look like if you rearranged the furniture. Some of you may have, moved the stuff in your bedroom or your house, and you're like, okay, will this fit? Would this be better? How will people walk past it without bumping their knees? Things like that. According to the working memory theory, we have like this little sketch pad in our working memory that allows us to visualize things. So according to the working memory theory, there are 3 functions to working memory that are bigger in a lot of ways than what we attribute to the box that is short-term memory. Okay, enough detail on that. Sorry, that's just one of my, areas. Okay, so now you got information into your short-term memory, and maybe you maintained it and rehearsed it well enough, or you thought about it deeply enough, or you processed it well enough that you actually ended up encoding that information from the short-term memory into the long-term memory storage box. Long-term memory is the last stage in the progression from shallowest to deepest storage. It's what it sounds like, long-term. Once you get the information into your long-term storage, once it's encoded there, it should, we think, stay there permanently. Barring some kind of head injury or stroke or something like that, that information should stay there indefinitely. Now the question is, can you retrieve it? In order to remember something, you have to pull it out of long-term memory, retrieve it into your short-term memory, where then you can focus on it again and pay attention to it. And a lot of times where we fall short is in that retrieval process. We have the thing stored in our long-term memory, and then retrieval's the problem. Okay, so these are the stages that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So let's start with the first stage, just this first aspect called how do we get information into either the short-term memory or transfer it into the long-term for permanent. We call that encoding. So how do we get information in? There are some things, some kinds of information. I'm going to go ahead and show you this flowchart again, because if you look at it, see that one big long arrow that goes from external events all the way to long-term memory, and it skips your sensory memory and it skips your short-term memory. That kind of jumping from the world into your long-term memory is called automatic processing. Automatic processing is effortless. You don't have to expend any of your cognitive effort on taking that information and putting it into your long-term memory store. It just voluntarily leaps into your memory. You don't even have to be paying attention to the information. I mean, one of the first things I mentioned on that flow chart, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, is that if you pay attention to some aspect of the information, it's novel or it's important, then you'll transfer it to short-term memory. Well, in automatic processing, you don't even have to be paying attention to it. It can enter your long-term memory sort of subconsciously without you putting any effort or attention on the task. So what kinds of things work like that? Well, procedural memories, like how to ride a bike. Once you've got that motor skill down, it is permanently stored in your brain, and you don't have to try to remember it. You don't have to pay attention to storing it. It just gets into your brain, and it's there permanently in that long-term storage. Conditioned associations, like we talked about in the last chapter, those are thought to be automatic processes. You don't have to deliberately say to yourself, I'm going to drool next time I hear about... In fact, you wouldn't think that. You wouldn't think, well, the only reason why I'm doing this activity is because I expect to get a reward from it, and I sit there expectantly doing it. You don't have to be thinking thoughts like that for operant conditioning to work. These things happen automatically and can create really durable long-term associations. Other things that are automatically processed are certain kinds of information, like your position in space. One of the things I always like to do with my in-person students, they're sitting in class and I ask them, point north. There's always the jokers who point, straight up like at the sky, but that's not north. So point north. And I'm going to stare at you all uncomfortably and tell you all point north, so just go ahead and conform and get it over with, right? So eventually everybody points. What's funny is that almost everyone in the class is pointing somewhere in the northern hemisphere. They might be pointing more east than north, they might be pointing more west than north, but they're somewhere in the north area. There will be a couple of students who are pointing more south than north, but most are pointing northy, northish, north-esque. Why? They've gotten out of their cars or off the bus. They've walked through the hallways of the campus. They found their way into the room and then had to, wend their way between the seats in order to find their chair. And as they were doing that, their brain was processing automatically their location relative to the mountains or the lake or the freeway or the sun or whatever cue they're relying on. Their brain was processing that, and you do it automatically. In fact, you do it better if you don't try to do it. If you don't try and think, and in fact, some students are really reluctant to point, and so I go, you know what? Don't think about it. Just let your finger go, and we all know you're not owning this. Your finger's deciding for itself, and those students almost always are pointing north. The more you try to know where north is, the less likely you are to know. It's like it's this automatic thing that, in fact, they think we have the same thing in our brains that migrating birds have, that allow us to basically orient to magnetic north. So it's an automatic process. Passage of time, same thing. I always like to ask my 2-hour students this question because if I only have you for an hour, it's hardly anybody makes a mistake. We're an hour and a half into a 2-hour class, and I'll ask, okay, so don't look at the clock. What time is it? And most people are within 5 minutes early or 5 minutes late, within that range of the accurate time. Because for most of us, we can automatically process the passage of time to within about a 5-minute error per hour. So it's not perfect. Within 24 hours, that's a lot of error that we might be engaging in. But of course, we also rely on other cues like light and whether I just woke up and stuff like that. So we tend to be pretty darn accurate in estimating the passage of time. There are some exceptions. If you're really engaged in a really engrossing activity, time can pass and you have no concept that time's passed. But for most of us, it's such an automatic process that you can actually do it in your sleep. You may have had the experience where you wake up without needing your alarm. Maybe you set your alarm for 6 a.m. and you woke up at 5:55. And you're like, why did I wake up 5 minutes early? Well, your brain was processing the passage of time, and it woke you up because it knew that it was almost time to wake up. It's such an automatic process and takes no effort, takes no consciousness. Also, frequency is another example. This is one that I always like to show my students in class, so I'll let you play along. Okay, so check out the screen. How many ducks were there? Most people correctly report the number of ducks. One of the things, I love this picture because you got the white duck off by the side. Presumably that's mommy or something, I don't know. But I usually get people saying 6, wait, I think there were 7. And your brain just gets sort of a glimpse of it. It also holds it briefly in iconic memory, which we'll talk about later. But without having to think about it, as an adult, you can process the frequency of things like how many shots were fired or how many ducks ran in front of you when you were crossing the road and stuff like that. No effort required. Now, there's a really special kind of automatic process called flashbulb memory. And flashbulb memory refers to those events that you all have had at least one flashbulb in your life. I'll try and describe examples that'll make you think, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. Flashbulb memories occur when you have a big burst of adrenaline because you're either happy, scared, sad, shocked, something like that. A big burst of adrenaline that causes your brain to say, uh-oh, this is really important, I better capture this. And so you store everything that is related to that event. It's like a flashbulb has gone off, and everything that got illuminated by the flashbulb got stored along with the actual content of the memory. So you might have a flashbulb for maybe a car accident you were in, and you don't focus only on those details that led up to the accident, but you also remember what song was playing on the radio, or what your friend had just said right before the accident happened, or what the weather was like, not because it was raining and that's why you slid into the other car, but more like, I remember it was a beautiful crisp fall morning. And it has nothing to do with the accident. It absolutely was not a contributing factor, but you remember that. If you listen to people when they reflect on when they first heard about 9/11, they oftentimes will talk about the weather. New Yorkers will say it was such a beautiful day. It was a crisp fall morning, blue sky. I remember walking down the street and thinking to myself what a beautiful day it was, and then they insert their memory. What does the weather have to do with anything? Well, one of the things about flashbulb memories is that it seems to be a protective mechanism that allows us to avoid situations that have led up to us having an experience that leads to adrenaline rushes. If you think about like a deer out in the world, he goes to the watering hole and gets a drink of water, and then a mountain lion jumps out of the brush and tries to grab him. He escapes. It's going to be in his best interest to remember what time of day it was. Were the birds chirping or not chirping? Were there other cues that might have alerted me that something was wrong, so that the next time I'm down at the water hole, I can look for, like, what time of day was it? Do I hear any birds? Those kinds of things, so that I can avoid that situation in the future. Flashbulb memory was first coined, that name was first coined to describe the fact that people of a certain age all had very vivid memories of when they first heard that John F. Kennedy had been shot. And so the researchers originally thought it only worked for shocking news, and that it was always accurate, that your flashbulb memories would have all these details, and that the details would always be really accurate. What we now know is that it's not just shocking stuff, it can be anything that boosts your adrenaline. So it could be something exciting, it could be something really happy. Like, I have a flashbulb for the first time I ever saw my husband. He was in a group outside, and it was a sunny day. Of course, I remember the weather. But what was really particularly interesting about the sunny day is it seemed like the sun was hitting his head more brightly. He had hair, don't worry. But it seemed like he was more illuminated than everybody else. How stupid is that, right? How romance novel is that? But my flashbulb is obviously not accurate. His head was not being hit by the sun more dramatically than everybody else's. But that's how I remember it. And I remember that moment, that happy moment when I spotted this person across the room and thought, oh man, I got to meet that guy, right? Sadly, he does not have an equivalent flashbulb. I wish I could tell you. And he was across the room going, oh my gosh, he didn't even see me. No idea. It took me years before I finally met him. Luckily, we went to the same school, so we had opportunity. But that's a happy memory. The thing that flashbulbs do all have in common is that they all are for brief events. Seeing your future husband the first time, hearing about 9/11, being in a car crash. These are moments. You would not have a flashbulb memory for your entire wedding day. That's too much. You can't store all that as a flashbulb. You may have glimpses. I got married, as I make this recording, I got married 28 years ago. And I do recall a couple of little flashbulb kinds of things. I remember one of my bridesmaids and I looking through a crack in the door where we were in the room where we were getting dressed as the guests were coming through. And I was cracking my bridesmaid up saying stuff about the guests and what they were wearing and stuff. I don't even remember exactly what I was saying. All I remember is her just cracking up about what I was saying about my relatives while they were coming to the wedding. I don't remember what I was saying. My guess is it was probably not appropriate things, but I just had this flashbulb of her and I sort of hunched over the door looking through the crack and her laughing at what I was saying. That's kind of a flashbulb that you would expect. The details are a little shaky, but you have like this overall feeling. That's very typical of flashbulbs. So, okay, if only our lives could be filled with flashbulb memories for stuff that we need to know, like the stuff you're going to be tested on for a midterm. Wouldn't that be great if it would just leap in your head and then you could vividly recall it at will? But unfortunately, that's not how your memory works. So let's move on to the next video, and we'll come back and talk about how the rest of memories get into our head with a little effort. So we'll come back in the next segment for that.